So welcome everybody to today's Ask the Author session from the International Transport Forum. You're all very welcome. Today we're looking at Broadening Transport Appraisal with our lead author Rex Deighton-Smith. So quick housekeeping rules. We will have a roughly 10-minute presentation followed by your chance to ask Rex your questions following the publication of the report about 1 month ago. Please use the Q&A function in the Zoom chat to send us your questions. Don't use the chat function, we won't be able to see that. And you can already put your questions in from now into the Q&A function. So this report is looking at the change in policy, in transport policy objectives, moving from a mobility to an accessibility focus and trying to capture how our assessment of equity and equitable access for all can happen throughout transport project appraisal. So I will put the link to the report and the subsequent policy brief into the chat, and I'll introduce you to Rex Deighton-Smith, our lead author, who will start the presentation, followed by our chance to answer your questions. So very welcome, Rex.
Thanks, Ronan, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to today briefly introduce you to this recently published ITF Roundtable report on the topic of broadening transport appraisal. The context for the roundtable is one of widespread recognition that the objectives of transport policy have changed significantly in recent years, from a traditional focus on a mobility perspective and valuing benefits in terms of travel time savings. We've moved toward adopting a wider range of objectives and new sets of priorities. And this raises the question of how appraisal practice should change as a consequence. Ronan's already briefly mentioned some of the shifts in objectives, but at the top of the list, we have decarbonising transport, which is obviously a fundamental element of our government's wider responses to the climate change imperative. There's also increasing focus on equity of access to transport services, something which is measured in regional and social terms and increasingly in gender terms. We've moved away from the mobility perspective toward one focused on accessibility, which is based on recognition that transport demand is a derived demand and that people ultimately need to travel in order to reach desired goods and services. Urban policy considerations are also becoming increasingly important. We have a better understanding of noise and air pollution impacts related to road transport and a desire to ensure they're minimised, as also road accident costs. We're also increasingly aware of the benefits of active transport and looking to maximise those by promoting take-up of that mode. Finally, there's a focus on rationally allocating urban space, and that means pricing the urban space appropriately. Governments are also increasingly adopting strategic infrastructure plans, and this imposes an obligation on our appraisal practice to take account of the objectives that are identified in those plans. So what are the implications for appraisal practice in broad terms? We need to ensure that impacts relating to all of these objectives are being systematically identified and appropriately assessed, and that we're cognizant of all the trade-offs and synergies that are involved. But this raises the question of whether we need to adopt wholly new appraisal methods or whether it's a matter of modifying and supplementing existing ones. Finally, are there broader questions about the decision models we use and the processes we follow? Of course, cost-benefit analysis has been central to our appraisal practice for many decades. It's founded in welfare economics, and as a result, can provide us with clear information on the relative welfare impacts of different options. It favours thereby rational choice in what are often highly political decision environments. But critics have long argued that it has a limited ability to address equity issues and that it downplays those things that can't be monetised. Questions are also asked about its ability to address very long-term issues, with the argument often being that the use of discounting inevitably creates a bias toward short-term perspectives. As a result of these critiques, some argue for the replacement of cost-benefit analysis with multi-criteria analysis. This is open-ended and multidimensional in nature, being based on identifying and applying weights to different objectives and scoring each of our available options in terms of each of those criteria. But it is also criticised, in this case on the basis of the perceived arbitrariness in the assignment of those weights and scores. The argument is that it's thereby rendered open for manipulation by project proponents. Reflecting this, multi-criteria analysis has limited acceptance as an appraisal method in some countries. For example, in Australia, it is usable only as an adjunct to cost-benefit analysis and not as an alternative, while the UK's Treasury Green Book guidance counsels against its use in most circumstances. Significant work has been undertaken in recent years to improve the practice of cost-benefit analysis. Its scope is progressively being broadened, particularly through greater use of indirect valuation methods. Scenario analysis is also being more widely used to help us identify key uncertainties and explore their impact on likely outcomes. There are also moves to adopt different distributional weights. For example, by the use of a uniform value of travel time and travel time savings in preference to the traditional approach of valuing these in terms of wage costs. In some cases, inverse distributional weights are also promoted, these being based on the idea of according a greater value to accessibility gains that are made by groups that are least advantaged. An important issue in the current environment is that of whether cost-benefit analysis can deal adequately with long-term environmental impacts. As a result, a recent major review was conducted in the United Kingdom on this issue. And that review concludes that cost-benefit analysis can address such issues, including climate change, provided that appropriate input prices are consistently used. One significant change that we see in this regard is a conceptual shift in the basis for applying shadow prices to carbon. In a number of countries, notably in the UK and France in recent times, there's been a move toward applying values that are based on achieving the emissions reductions commitments that are set out in nationally determined contributions. And the result of this is the adoption of much higher values for carbon than has previously been the case. For example, the base case value in the UK guidance at present for 2030 is £280, which is over 320 euros. These much higher values will, of course, have major impacts on project selection and tend systematically to favour the adoption of investments in more sustainable modes. So our report concludes that an expanded cost-benefit analysis should remain at the core of our project appraisal practice, but that improvements to current practice are required. Additional tools are also needed to improve the information we have available on project impacts in different dimensions. That particularly means adopting accessibility and equity measures, and also explicitly analysing project impacts on the achievement of strategic objectives. Of course, if our analysis is becoming more complex and multifaceted, we'll face greater challenges in effectively presenting the results. We need to tailor our communications to the audience, both in terms of decision makers and stakeholders. This can be done most effectively by using clear summary appraisal documents, which present impacts on different objectives separately for the sake of transparency, and make use of aids like figures, graphs, and tables. This slide provides an example of one of those. It provides a graphic indication of the accessibility impact of a newly proposed transit system in terms of impacts on people living in a range of different identified geographical zones. The colour coding here clearly shows the change in the proportion of destinations that are available within a 45-minute travel time. This graph analyses the same data set in terms of socioeconomic deciles. You can see it clearly shows that the accessibility gains of the project would be widely shared, but that the biggest gains go to those with the lowest initial levels of accessibility. The report also argues that wider reforms to transport planning are needed. There are three key elements here: reform of the project identification process, improving the decision model, and using systematic ex post evaluations. Project identification is needed to be improved because better appraisal can only change outcomes if we select the right projects for appraisal in the first instance. This means framing problems better to reflect the broader objectives that we've identified in the needs case, identifying our alternatives accordingly, and accounting for equity objectives from the outset. And of course, stakeholder engagement is essential to this process. In terms of decision processes, the key insight of the report is that transport planning exhibits high failure rates, which impose major costs, and that these are primarily due to complexity and uncertainty in the decision environment, as well as the existence of limited stakeholder veto rights in many contexts. So a decision model should respond to these issues. It should avoid the traditional decide, announce, and defend paradigm in favour of making decisions progressively and using feedback loops, which enable decisions to be modified as new information becomes available. And again, stakeholder engagement needs to be maintained at all stages of this process. Finally, ex post evaluation can be a key means of improving ex ante appraisal. It can help us identify systematic biases and unanticipated impacts, but practical value has been limited to date because it's being used insufficiently and in unsystematic ways. Quality evaluation practice needs to be systematic, timely, sustained, and independent of project proponents. To finish with the report's recommendations, firstly, governments should develop long-term strategic infrastructure plans that identify all their policy objectives. Project appraisal processes and practices need to be broadened to ensure that they address all of those objectives. We need to incorporate accessibility indicators or other equity measures in our appraisals. Detailed guidance should be provided on addressing climate change impacts, and in particular, we should make sure that shadow carbon prices are linked to our emissions reductions commitments. Appraisal results need to be presented in a transparent and summary format that highlights the impacts on key policy priorities. Reports to decision makers should be focused on the needs case assessment and the summary appraisal document. And decision processes for our long-term investments should account for uncertainty and the need for broad stakeholder support. We need to make sure that we effectively integrate the three key elements of technical assessment, process management, and public engagement in our decision processes. We should undertake systematic ex post evaluation for all major infrastructure projects, and governments should consider using the permanent observatory model to maximise evaluation quality. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Rex, for a very clear presentation, despite having an enormous amount of content in it, much like this study and the report. Just a reminder, your questions, please use the Q&A function to send us your questions, which are already piling in, so thank you very much indeed. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. First off, we'll take a question just in from Michael Whittaker, who asks, Rex, if you could say something about the freight and logistics appraisal, as he's not finding a specific reference to that in the material that's already online.
I think the report addresses the issues of appraisal in a fairly generic way. The methodological discussion really doesn't distinguish between the passenger and the freight side of transport. It is, despite what you've said, covering a hell of a lot of analytical ground in a fairly small amount of space. And so I think the perspective that was taken was one of issues that were generally applicable to as wide a range of appraisal practice as possible.
Thanks, Rex, and I'll put some more links to material around this study in the chat very soon. There's another question that it's I'm sure in everyone's mind, which is looking for examples of good practice in appraisal processes. Rex, you mentioned that there's little ex post evaluation in practice. I know we touched on examples from France, Norway, and the UK. I think, are any of those considered best in class?
There is some very interesting material there, and also case studies from Israel, and the couple of examples that were included in my presentation, in fact, come from one of the input papers for this roundtable, which discusses at some length recent practices in Israel. And as you say, the report itself also addresses practices in those three other countries. I would say that these are all cases of promising practices of new innovations. I don't know that we would point to any particular country having achieved best practice at this point, but I think all of those case studies are useful for people looking for ways of improving current practices.
Thanks very much, Rex. I will just pop into the chat a link to our just issued short format policy brief on this topic, where you'll find a little bit of information about the Israeli as well as the French, Norwegian and UK cases. So don't hesitate to have a quick read of that, a 4-page policy brief just out last week. There is an earlier question in from Asif Faiz, I think from the Asian Development Bank, who's asking how do we take account of price and income inelasticities in transport demand when we're estimating trips or traffic. I don't know if this report touches on that area, Rex.
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. So I probably don't have a great deal to offer on that particular issue. There is a little more said on some of the more speculative, let's say, innovations in cost-benefit analysis practice, and I think I briefly mentioned the idea of distributional weights being applied. There are also some mentions of emerging methods that I guess draw the distinction between people's preferences as citizens and as individual consumers, and that I think is of some interest in this context of what people actually want and are willing to pay for when it comes to major infrastructure investments as a particular class of expenditure.
Thanks very much, Rex. An interesting question in from Ozan Yilmaz on the carbon pricing issue that you alluded to. Do you have any recommendation for alignment between countries on carbon prices?
We don't, beyond the I guess, recommendation that countries should align between the particular emissions reductions objectives, their nationally determined contributions, and the shadow prices that they use. And I think what we see is an increasing convergence in terms of those specific NDCs over time. And so you would anticipate that if governments did move in that direction of achieving that alignment between their shadow carbon prices and their emissions reductions commitments, that you would also see convergence in the values that they would be tending to adopt. But having said that, probably the key shift is between historically the use of values that are based on values in carbon markets for tradable emissions permits to one that's based on the question of meeting those targets. We're seeing in the short term increases in values in the UK case of up to an order of magnitude. And that 2030 value, I think, was something like 3.5 times as high as the one that was adopted in the previous UK guidance. So this conceptual shift on its own is making a very large difference in terms of the ranking of different project options.
Surely a sign of the times. And Andrew Price reiterates what I think is a perennial question for anybody working in transport policy or a transport appraisal. He asks that in terms of making transport plans, there's a real conflict between government and long-term. Presumer we're alluding to the general election cycle in most countries. How can this challenge be overcome?
Well, I just cite last year's working group report on strategic infrastructure planning, to which we also allude in the current roundtable report. Both of those documents recommend that governments adopt strategic infrastructure plans. And this issue of addressing the political cycle and trying to increase the role of rational decision-making is really core in terms of that recommendation. We also note in the strategic infrastructure planning report that there is a trend toward the use of independent infrastructure advisory bodies across a range of ITF member countries, and that also is endorsed on the basis of being a useful tool in trying to minimise the role of short-term political considerations in infrastructure decision-making.
Thanks indeed, Rex. We're just going to pop a quick poll into the chat, as you're very numerous in this Ask the Author, just to let us know how we're doing and if you find this format is useful. 2 quick questions. Thanks very much. The next question is from Brendan Finn. Brendan asks, or makes the point that the changes in good practices seem to be primarily in the appraisal practice itself, and wonders, is this resulting in a material change to selected projects and their outcomes? And if so, are these truly win-wins in which additional objectives are being met or partially met? And are the traditional goals of mobility still being retained?
I think this is very much a work in progress, and so it is probably at this stage would be quite difficult to demonstrate systemic changes. I know from discussions with some of our experts that in the UK, where, as I say, the shadow carbon price has made a step change in recent times, the issue is being very strongly argued as to whether certain projects that have previously passed through the appraisal process but have not yet commenced construction ought to be revisited on the basis that it seems quite clear that substitution of the current shadow carbon prices for the previous ones would yield probably quite different outcomes. As you could imagine, for various process and bureaucratic reasons, there's quite a strong pushback against that. But I think the fact that that's a live issue at the least tells us that there is significant potential for different outcomes in terms of project choice to result from the adoption of these changes.
Okay, I'm just popping into the chat the full roundtable content page. This includes a very nice summary from the chair, Robert Bickerman from Imperial College London, as well as the presentations that happened during that roundtable, so you can get a taste of the amount of detail that was gone into over this. Discussions themselves are never made public. They're under Chatham House rules, but you can see the 4 presentations from the roundtable on that link that's in the chat at the moment. Rex, the report recommends that governments consider also an independent observatory model as a vehicle for evaluations. Can you talk a little bit about how that works and what that would involve?
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned having put the project page link up in the chat function, and that's useful because one of the input papers to the roundtable presented by Alain Bonafus gives a very good rundown on the use of the observatory model in France, where it's been fairly long-standing practice, albeit its use is still developing and broadening. But this is really, I guess, the nearest that we have to best practice in terms of systematic ex post evaluation at the present. It's particularly been applied in the road context, but is also being applied to rail in France. The key points are that the evaluation's scope and focus is identified and agreed before the commencement. It's commenced in a timely way, usually at project inception or very soon after. And resourcing is also agreed so that it's sufficient to ensure that a good and sophisticated evaluation is undertaken. Probably the last point is that it's also required under the French legislation that the evaluation be conducted at arm's length from the project proponents and from the project builders. So that also obviously favours the quality of the resulting evaluation.
Thanks indeed, Rex. A direct link into Alain Bonneau's presentation is also in the chat. So we're reaching the end. If you've got any additional questions, now's the time to pop them into the Q&A function. One last question that's outstanding, Rex, is on portfolio level reporting, and analysis of progress in achieving strategic objectives. How can that be achieved in practice, or do we have examples of that being achieved in practice?
Again, I think this is very much a developing area, but I would point primarily to the rise of the independent infrastructure advisory bodies. One of the key functions that they perform in most countries in which they're a feature of the system is to provide a periodic stocktake of infrastructure, of the performance of infrastructure projects and of key needs, having weighed up the current state of play. And it's that sort of global level assessment is the kind of thing that we're pointing to in terms of trying to bridge the gap between individual project appraisals and systematically making sure that our strategic objectives are being met.
Thank you very much, Rex. In the chat, I've included a quick link to our subscriptions where you can find updates from all of ITF work. This is an area that crosses many of our strategic priorities and is more and more linked to the universal access requirement or priority set out by the ITF Secretary General. So we are bang on time. If there's no other questions, we can leave it at that. Thank you very much indeed, Rex, for an excellent and concise presentation. Links to our social media channels are in the chat. There'll be more on this subject coming up over the next few months. So please do stay in touch. Thank you very much.